To start out, we're going to kind of look at what it is that security and cybersecurity is doing. So that is the big thing I was listening for, trying to understand how much of those, at least for the first couple hours, we already have a background in. And it sounds like, from what I understand, this next section is going to be very helpful to a lot of people. And I'll try to keep it at a minimal technical level. But if it gets too, if I go too far in a technical direction, that's the one thing I want you to kind of, let me know. Hey, stop, explain that. Or where's the relevance in this is a good question. If you don't understand how it's relevant to what you're doing, maybe it isn't. And maybe I need to change direction. So let me know when that kind of comes up. But the basics in cybersecurity, and I put up a couple definitions just from the dictionary. Anybody can find these. If you look at security, Merriam-Webster says is a state of being protected or safe from harm. So cybersecurity in the same dictionary says measures taken to protect a computer or computer system, such as on the internet, from unauthorized access or attack. Now I would add to this the definition of security, the state of being protected from harm, because you're also looking at how do you protect your computer systems or your infrastructure from harm, as well as measures taken to protect information. So where do we start? The biggest thing in doing in cybersecurity, keeping the good guys in line. The people you have in your systems and you trust with your data, give them access to, making sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing is actually probably the biggest part of cybersecurity. The second thing I have on here is keeping the bad guys out, which is the thing that gets the most publicity. But actually, a lot less time in cybersecurity is spent doing these type of activities. And a lot fewer people, and usually very technical people, which is what you hear in the news, those people that are on the wires or doing hacking, and it looks so confusing. But for the most part, cybersecurity is that first part. And that kind of goes into preventative security. How do you set up, and I heard risk is the primary theme I see in here, how do you set up to prevent risks? So we're going to prevent things from happening. And then to a lesser extent, the reactive security, which is how do you react to a breach? How do you recover when something has gone awry? So anybody ever heard security referred to in the PAIN acronym? What are the basic 4 things being done by cybersecurity? Remember the word PAIN. Privacy, protecting information so that the people who have access to it, the people that created it, are the people who have control over it. The A, authentication, verifying people and systems before they have access to your information. So proving who the actors are on our data in the virtual environment. Integrity, I for integrity, proving a piece of information has not changed from one point in time to another. So this includes over a wire or in memory. If you have a piece of data and you save it somewhere and you pull it out a year later, how do you prove that that's the same data that you saved a year ago? Or if you transfer from here to New York, how do you prove that that's the same data that they received that you sent? And that's the question of integrity. Whether saved on hardware or transmitted. And then non-repudiation. This is a big one for risk and kind of accountability of who did what actions. So proving that somebody took an action in the cyber world. If you have a transaction done by somebody halfway across the world, how do you as the person, the recipient of that transaction, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that that person did the action and it wasn't just someone pretending to be them somewhere in the world? And then that proof is strong enough so they can't deny it. Go ahead.
I don't want to jump ahead of anything you're going to do, but that really reminded me of of post-loss forensics that have to be done. And, you know, we have service providers that we've set up to help after a breach, and they're going to try to find out how much of that is true and is not true. I presume you're going to be talking about forensics type work later.
I will get into that, and I'll, you know, especially from what I heard, we'll try to focus on those things. But in general, these transactions in the real world, when you do business with somebody face to face, the human does these transactions. You verify that this is your information before you give it to somebody. You verify that person. You verify that it hasn't been changed. You scan it, and you prove that that person did the transaction. You add a virtual environment halfway around the world, you don't even see these people now a lot of times. So now these questions and these controls that you have in the real world get implemented through cyber transactions. And that's what we'll talk about in this first section is, what are these base transactions that cyber is doing to implement these things that we already know in the real world, that we do without thinking? So first, some market characteristics. This one I'll kind of breeze through, but feel free if you have any questions on stuff that you want a little more explanation on. It's a little bit about industry. Cybersecurity is basically entirely out of the public eye. And a lot of times it's like somebody taking their vitamins. How do you know whether they did it? They only know if they do it. Or a little more crude example, you can let an infant run around without a diaper for how long? At some point, you're going to have a mess. So this is the approach that a lot of cybersecurity and digital information technology have taken in the past. Is it's an acceptable risk, and we'll deal with it when it comes up. Market characteristics. Mostly incident and fear driven for spending on security. And that's for me, being in the security field, this has been the most frustrating piece in general, and everywhere I've been, is everybody wants to know how they can minimize. What do I have to implement? And it's, hopefully that trend is going to change with awareness, but probably not until we have a lot of compromises that people really feel the pain there. And I think that's a lot where the insurance industry comes into the picture here. But anywhere value of spending is provable to offset risk is another place that spending is done in security. So the business prospects around that, making a business case for cost savings, a lot of times doesn't do it, but if you can add where costs are directly related to risk, you become a little bit more effective. So quantifying that risk exposure and the mitigation costs together is where the strongest business cases are made in security. And the biggest area people always look at, hey, I'll wait until the next generation, I'll make sure I put my security in there. So it's important to, if you find when somebody's working on the next generation, that's when the spending usually happens and when people actually get security implementation. Or new regulation, newly regulated areas, which this is where the most of the money is spent in security in the businesses. A new regulation comes on, everybody scurries to make sure they meet it. So customer sets, traditional areas in security, basically from that last comment, heavily regulated industries. So banking, government organizations, medical, utilities, accounting, or revenue motivated. Software, intellectual property, consumables, things where they know that if people steal it, they stole all their money. If somebody breaks the software and publishes on the internet, how many people use the cracked software, they know they lose money. These companies have been motivated. Financial and credit cards, you know somebody steals a credit card, they use it, they can directly quantize that. And this goes back to that, being able to quantize the loss and the risk. Perception or reputation base is another big area for a customer sets. Companies that already have had a compromise somehow seem to know the value of security. Or where sensitive information loss threatens the whole environment. You'll see the leading government, military are sometimes where the most cybersecurity has been done, because they know losing their information is the whole business model. Other ones that might maybe not be so aware of is like VeriSign. Their whole business model is signing certificates. So protecting that ability to sign and making sure that those private confidential materials that they use to sign is really their whole business model. And it's one string of bits that if they lose it, their whole business model goes out the door. They're very motivated about the perception in security. And digital asset compromise, networks, critical infrastructure. The biggest leading on these have been like your satellite providers and internet providers, who when people steal service, they lose revenue directly, and the perception with that, as well as critical infrastructure. You can't have a critical infrastructure network broken and taken down offline from somebody over a cyber connection. Organizational resiliency. This is becoming a bigger one, kind of like going green, where companies are looking at, hey, what can I say that I have this security that makes me look better to my peers, makes me look better in the news, makes me be able to publicize that I have done measures that maybe everybody else isn't doing yet. And then insurance and monetary incentive. Aware of that, if there's a value for an insurance policy that can be offset with how much protection you put in. And that's what I hope to really relay to you here, is that there is ways to quantitate and qualitate the risk factor in your cybersecurity operations. And forward-looking business models, the design approach. I'll put it in the next one. I'm looking at my business model down in the future. And security is valuable for me. And you see there's mobile phones coming up now that they say, we have a secure mobile phone, and that's their whole value to marketing it, is that it's secure. Key industry segments, big in security, consulting, relatively neutral. These people have been in for a while. Product manufacturers, I don't see represented too much here, but product manufacturers make a specific product. A lot of times you'll find that they are very vested in that product and a little bit reluctant to let anybody know that there's a vulnerability, even if there is, so they'll make it sound the best even if it isn't. And you get these vendors come into companies all the time, and this is probably the most confusing aspect when I go in as a neutral party and talk to some of my consulting clients, is they say, well, we've had 5 vendors come in and they all say their security is perfect, and none of it is anything the same at all. So how do we know how to judge what is right and what's not? We'll talk about that a little bit more in the future too. Cyber solutions providers, you'll see a lot of software providers. There's countless applications you can buy that say, we're doing something in software that benefits cybersecurity. Talk a little bit about those as it goes on. Network operations and software development, use of some of the cybersecurity primitives we'll talk about here, and in this first couple portions we'll have, so you can understand what we're talking about when we see what cybersecurity is doing. And then ecosystem controls, standards bodies, idealist unification, things where people and organizations are getting together and saying, how, with all the knowledge from all our joint members, how do we make the best cybersecurity kind of going forward, and solutions, and what should we have into all our designs. And you can look at this. I've put this together as kind of a running list of companies I've either worked with or been familiar with or talked to people in, and categorized where they fall. You have government sector, and you can definitely take, this one is valuable. Let me just get my pointer here. On your slides to take home, you can definitely say, if you ever need a reference to what companies I can talk to or what solutions may be around in the government sector or in secure code development. Here's a list of companies. Penetration testing, actually looking at networks for vulnerabilities. technical design, and this is very cryptographic-centric type companies, network people, software security vendors, consulting companies, critical infrastructure, a lot of hardware, more network-related is there as well. But just good reference for you if you need to know who's in the industry or what you're looking at and where they might fall. Business development approaches, influence and compliance to regulation. We talked about that top one. Design, architecture, next generation, those two. Active vulnerability and boundary management. This is the one you hear the most about because cybersecurity is so synonymously associated with people hacking and protecting from hacking. Actually, a very small portion of the work in a company, in an IT department, is around this type of work, and it's usually one or two very technical people, but for some reason this has been associated with the key aspects of cybersecurity. I'd say less than 10% of the work that is done and the focus that needs to be done for cybersecurity is this technical wire tracing type of activities. Risk-based analysis sounds a lot where the interest more to this particular group, the assessment of chance of risk versus other risks, and comparative relation to the business model. And in quantitative, anywhere you can put a cost of mitigation to a cost of accepting a risk. For that, there's a lot of chain of trust. We'll talk about that in some of the later sections of how do you see all the areas that have to be trusted and have to be chained to have a secure environment, and then look at if I break one of those links, if I have 15 links in the chain and I break 3 of them, I can then make a percentage, a quantitative percentage of what the risk is in that organization. And monetary value of mitigation, offsetting cost and risk. And petty theft has been a marketing approach where a lot of, you see in the stores, you have the little things on the clothing, where so they walk out the door, they get buzzed or whatever. But that type of petty theft has been really offset well by cyber operations. And you'll see those industries as far as, and that's where the credit card industry comes in a lot, is how do you stop, if there's 1 million people doing transactions, how do you minimize a big majority of them? Revenue loss protection. Counterfeiting, copy protection, more in the software and consumables type of area. I'm going to kind of breeze through the rest of this business development section and get to some of the later stuff. Marketing of going green, though. This is a good one we'll spend a little time on. The different industries have varying primary concerns when it comes to cybersecurity. And this is the biggest reason why that you can't just say, everybody do this in cybersecurity, because some industries don't care about certain transactions and they care more about others. If you look at the banking industry, they care about transaction integrity, making sure that all those transactions that happen from all the endpoints are accurate and that they can be proved later, so that non-repudiation piece. They also care about the integrity of data, but they don't care as much if people see these transactions because they're on open networks. So privacy, the access to them, is not really a concern for this industry at all, other than for small parts of the company, accounting, things like that. But the overall industry isn't really focused on privacy. They're focused more on its transaction integrity. You come down to the medical and healthcare, and they're more focused on individual privacy, those records. The transactions are all done by people. So they don't care at all. The transaction integrity is not even something that they even think about. So these two industries are very different right from the start. And then the pharmaceutical is And medical equipment is about authentication. They want to make sure that those drugs are authentic. The transactions, again, are brokered by people, pharmacists, doctors, whatnot. And they want to make sure the products are authentic. If they're plugged into electronic equipment that connects to the humans, being an authentic product is more important. They don't care who knows about it. It's all public information. But they want to protect the authentication process and make sure that you have the right piece of equipment, the right medication. So now they're, once again, different as an entire industry from the healthcare, even though they have the healthcare connection to the individual privacy, their main focus is different than these other two industries entirely. And you come down to credit cards. The biggest thing a credit card company has to work with is their internal process of handling billions of numbers and assigning them and governing them and how they connect to what account and what person. And that is their primary focus. You go to a credit card company, they're scrambling internal all the time. How can we protect this? Where do we keep it? Who has access to it? Who has visibility? As well, they have some individual privacy things in there and some other aspects that go along with the maintaining of those credit card numbers. But credit card numbers are more valuable and more targeted in aggregation. So the more of them you have, the more people go after them. And software and media, they care about use protection. They're giving this out to everybody. They just want to make sure that the right people can't, or the wrong people can't use it. So privacy is not a concern. Transactions are brokered by people for the most part. But that use prevention and the keys that you get with your software, distributing those and preventing people from copying and pirating is their main focus. Entirely different than these other industries. And shipping, once again, we go back to transaction integrity, but a different type of transaction integrity between organizations, not on an individualized basis. So they want to know that shipping package A, 10,000 of them went over one route, and then they all split into different directions. Where are they at? And the integrity of the transition between organizations. And then government is more concerned about information security. Things that a lot of these others don't even really care about. Their information's given away, other than small privacy information with, and I think I missed one, huh? We'll go back and talk about critical infrastructure. So their main focus is monitoring the wire, seeing who's in and active real time. They want to have this set up where they're like, okay, we have somebody coming in from China right now, they have access to this file, they're getting to this. They need to know that real-time information. They're one of the only business models that actually needs that, but yet most of cybersecurity was developed in the government, so it's pushed over from forensic knowledge to all these other business models who don't really focus on that particular aspect of security. Go back to critical infrastructure. They care, it is more focused on trusted communications. If you're controlling electromechanical equipment over a network connection, you have to verify before that operation is made that you trusted who sent the signal, and you trusted everybody in the network that sent that. And everybody is not people now. Everybody is systems and machines. And across a network for a utility company, it can go through 100 machines to close a breaker halfway across the state, and no person was in the line at all. So now that trusted communications, time-related operations, and availability are their prime security focus. And service and distribution networks are concerned with channel protection. So they want to make sure that the end people are authenticated and that the channel is nobody's tapped into it. So they're looking at how do they secure the channel. They put a box in your house, they have a box somewhere else. They control those endpoints. But the channel is what they are most concerned about. And that's, once again, a different focus for cybersecurity. And see, the biggest thing you take from this is different industries will care about something in cybersecurity that another industry doesn't even matter to them. So knowing the security needs of Go ahead.
Can we go back one slide and look at the whole section? When I look at this, I see the counties are involved with 4 or 5 of these.
And that's why this was an important one, because you are touching these different industries, and you can't just go in and tell them, this is what you need to do in cybersecurity. And that's what the next slide starts with. How do you associate that with their market? And sorry about the touchy mouse thing here. So knowing the security needs of your market, and you might be walking into a company that is concerned with a different set of cybersecurity needs. You need to know, first of all, what they're concerned with and what is their primary objective when it comes to digital security. Which are most important and which are they going to spend money on? Which are which are cost affecting? Which ones are going to affect their bottom line? They're not going to spend money on most, and the majority of industries aren't going to spend money on monitoring who's on the wire like the government does and who's access to what file at what time, because their business model is more cost effective to spend that money somewhere else. But yet, information security, and most people, the intrinsic background of people in cybersecurity comes from that government sector. So that'll be pushed in a lot of directions to business models that it doesn't make sense in. So the big thing is, once you know those primary needs of that industry, you want to make that the primary objective of what you're trying to cover with them. But then also know the secondary needs and things that are going to be important to them also, and things are going to be important to the industry, and things are going to be important perception-wise. So your whole approach is to find their focus, but then also what I'm addressing the focus, now what also other things subsequently are we covering while we're addressing your primary focus. And this is really the key to success. But these areas, some of them might be their primary focus. 2 or 3 of them might be their primary focus. But then another bigger group of them could be things that are also addressed by covering the primary focus, or with solutions or recommendations that cover their primary focus. So everything I'm telling you is cybersecurity is not a technical practice. You hear in the news, it's about hacking, it's about hackers, it's about protecting from it, it's about the software, it's about communications, it's about over the internet. It's really a business, cybersecurity we focus on the business aspects. And cybersecurity is really about controlling digital actions that we do in the real world, but using electronics. So everything that you do in the real world as a business action has to have a counterpart in the virtual world. And that's really what cybersecurity does. And this is why it's not a sole technical practice. You have to think about the business action, the business need, and then go into how do we do that in the virtual environment. Like we said in the last slide, focus on the common needs relevant to the particular business, and then implement those respective organizations and focus on those. Like I said, a lot of it's technical focused, white papers, but bringing cybersecurity to larger market. This is a lot of stuff that I do with trying to get the word out that I originally come from a technical background. But then the more I got into cybersecurity, the more I had to link it to all these business transactions and business features. But building a framework, and you'll hear me talk a lot about security management framework. It's kind of a framework that I put together. I know someone back here asked about a framework that looks at the whole organization of what they need in security and how they break it down. But the security management framework looks at accenting portions that fit the business model. This is really getting tricky. but knowing the risk associated with other areas as well, and being able to have an entire framework that builds awareness around where they all fit together. And shows solutions with the primary concern, but then also the other areas in security, and being able to manage which ones of those. And when I talk about security management, it's kind of the difference between balancing a company's bills or spreadsheet versus having a cash flow model. How do you manage the moving components of a business when it comes to cybersecurity? And that's what security management will focus on a lot of. So any questions? That section I didn't want to spend too much time on, but I'd like any questions you have or input. No? So the next section is growth of products in the digital age. And this is something that when I talk to younger people, I try to say, hey, here's what the market is doing, and here's why that everybody really needs to understand the at least base aspects of cybersecurity. But traditionally, security has been a very technical practice. We talked about that before. Very few hackers, years of specialized education. In the digital age, security is now everybody. Future business managers will be security managers. People who understand this will be the leaders tomorrow. Start out with cybersecurity and understanding. Another thing, these individual devices, personal mobile devices, become people's identity. You store personal information on your smartphone all the time. I know I do. I hit the save, and some of my credit card information's in there, and if somebody gets a hold of that, I interface with people virtually that I've never seen all the time, and I do business transactions with them. So if somebody stole my device, and they could probably prove they're me by the information in my device better than I could prove on me to someone in a virtual environment. So these devices connect to the world, but at the same time, they store your information. So somewhere inside that device is a line that says, this is my stuff, this connects to the world. That line is very fuzzy right now. Does anybody know where that line is in their device that they hold in their hand? What information you put in there is available to the world and what's only yours? Just to say, the digital world is still in its infancy state. All these things that people do for business transactions, a lot of them still need to have a counterpart in the virtual environment. Learning is done on computers. I'll just kind of scroll through this one. Most of you, if you have children, you see that, come into that everything is going to be connected. The future Internet of Things, we've heard probably a lot of times, is a picture here of, eventually at some time in the future, anything you hook up to a network, and then those networks are connected, everything kind of becomes connected. I like this slide. If you think about back in the adoption of the computer age, the personal computer, about 1980s, it was into what we're looking at a growth curve here, the market adoption where only novelists were working with computers, and then through the late 90s into early 2000s, we had a linear growth and the industry exploded. Now thousands of companies exist to service this industry. Where back in 1980, it was 5 or 6, and it was very technical type driven. And now we've kind of reached a market saturation. So if we look at the typical 3 parts of a growth curve, what does the future of the Internet of Things look like in comparison to what we already know about the growth of personal computers? I show in this picture a 10 times scale. If the blue is the growth of personal computers, and 10 times that, eventually everything that's electronic and electric will be connected, either by default or it's just kind of migrating that way. How many PCs do you have in your home? your office? How many do you have access to? Now think about how many electric things you have that plug in, and the ratio of how many there is of those versus how many PCs. This Internet of Things and this next generation of the connectivity of the world is probably 10 to 1,000 times bigger. So when you look at a growth adoption curve, and that's only showing it 10 times larger, what is the world going to look like in the next 15, 25 years? And how many devices are out there? Cybersecurity and virtual security is going to be bigger than the things we already know in the physical world of transactions for business. Just the sheer amount of connections out there. Any questions on those sections? This next section, from what I heard going around, might be very helpful to a lot of you. I've tried to boil down the very basics of computer operations needed to understand what cybersecurity is doing. So if I looked at the computer data basics, computers process digital bits on the computer. Everybody's heard of digital bits, right? What is a digital bit? It's like a switch that's turned on or off. I'll give you this little example. So if I have 4 switches, right now they're all off, I can say I can read the position of the switches, and that's all zeros. If I turn 2 of those on, now I read the position of the switches, I have this pattern, 0, 1, 0, 1. If I start grouping these together, I represent a binary number. And this is the basic form of how computers use data, how they are organized internally. So then computers have to translate those computer numbers, those ones and zeros, to something that's human readable. So that's what I'm going to show here is how is that done. So if I take those switches and I put them together, all zeros, that can equal 0. You can kind of make that leap with me. If I turn the first one on, I can get a 1. You can make that leap with me too. From 0 to 1, even counting in decimal, this makes sense. So now if I go to the next phase where in decimal, you go from 9 to 10. What do? You change the 9 to a 0, and you increment the next place. So now if I do the same thing, I change the first one was a 1, I change it to a 0, because 1's as high as it can go, and I increment the next place, I get what looks like 10 in decimal, but really it's 1, 0, which now we represent as 2. Okay? This too technical for anybody and too in depth? But anyway, if I take and now I continue counting like we know to count, I increment the next lower one, get a 1, 1, we see that as the 3. Make the next thing where you increment the lowest one, carry the 1, 1, 0, 0, a 4. At the next increment, a 5. So what I've shown you here is now how those 1s and 0s become something we know in numbers that can associate back to people. So with 4 bits, we can get to 8. So now the next step of that is, how do you make sense of those bits and those numbers? Is by grouping amounts of them together. We showed 4, grouping 4 of them together, and we can make sense of that from 0, 1 to 8, 0 to 7 is actually how it goes, but we can make sense of that from 0 to 8. So the simplest is called a byte. The smallest data length is called a byte. And we group 8 of those 1s and 0s together, so 8 digital bits, and they mean something to the computer. The computer says, all my memory, I divide up into these groups of 8. And this is how I make sense of those ones and zeros. So counting then is done in something called hexadecimal. Bear with me for a minute, watch it. Not too important to understand it, but recognition of characters is important. So if I have all zeros, I get a 0. And the next 16 combinations I represent from 0 to 9 and then A through F. So 1, 2, remember the counting we did before, the decimal, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now what do we do after 9 on the hexadecimal side on the right? We go to A. B, C, D, E, F. So now we're 0F. We said there's 16 combinations. The next one, carry the 1 here. What's the next place look like? Anybody guess? Tell me what the next on the right column would look like.
1, 0.
You're right. 1, 0. So now, these numbers on the right is what you'll see in the computer your files are made of. If you ever open up any computer file in like a text editor and just see what the contents are, you see a lot of that, right? Anybody ever done that? So what now would the all ones look like? Guess anybody? Any guesses? FF. So now if you look at two places here, 2 places, how many combinations is there in 2 places? $256 combinations with 2 places. This is very powerful. This is why computers can do things so much more intensive than people, because they're very compact as far as how they understand data. And that whole, this here, this hexadecimal counting, 256 of them down to FF with two characters is what you'll see all your computer stores everywhere. That's all they store. So now, the thing we're going to take from this is to realize these are a number. It's a number that uses letters to represent the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spaces. But it's a number to the computer. So now we can do mathematical equations on anything on the computer. This is the basis of cybersecurity. And we know that everything the computer saves is right here in this list. Every possible combination in memory anywhere. And they're all numbers. And numbers can have mathematical equations done on them. So storage is measured in terms of bytes. And somebody said, what's a gig? You know, we're going out to party and hoe down on the weekend. But a gig is a measurement of a number of these bytes. A gig is what, 1 billion bytes? I think that's the, I don't even keep those in my mind anymore. Interesting, sometime go out to the internet and do a search for what's the next higher from a terabyte, and the list of what they're called, exabytes, and they're already mapped out like the next 1,000 years probably, but a lot of weird words. So a megabyte is 1 million bytes. Next concept is something that, now we saw that everything this computer stores is those hexadecimal numbers. But now there's a couple concepts and ways that it can store information. A set length, which the byte we talked about, the computer can group these together and automatically know when it's doing operations. It does them really fast because it knows to grab 8, grab 8, grab 8, grab 8, grab 8, grab 8, and do your operation on them. So it's a set length piece of data. And this is important for computers when they're running continuously and fast and synchronized inside the computer. they can run really fast. But now we get to what, and they're always in multiples of 2. You saw how everything grows. You ever wonder why every time a new version of the computer comes out, they seem to double it? They double the amount of memory, they double everything. It's because this binary effect, what they've done over the development of the computer industry is take what they already had, shrink it down by half, and double the amount there. Take that, shrink it down by half, double the amount there. And through the years, that's what they've been doing. So they've been making these millions and billions of circuits on small computer chips, and then the next time they make them, they just shrink it all down and double the amount there. And you get twice the speed, twice the memory, twice the processing capability. But that's why growth has always been in 2s, because of the nature of logic and binary. But you can't count in 10s on the computer. So we went to hexadecimal. So set length are easy, fast to operate, but people aren't going to understand them because they're not in people language. So now we go to the next, but the computer knows exactly how much data to use, so it's quick operating. The next thing that really realizes how applications and things that people use store information is in these variable length pieces of data. So they put a header and a footer on every piece of data, and in the header it says what's in between and how many. Now you can make, these could be bytes, they could be files, they could be MP3 files, they could be anything, but a variable amount of them. So the difference here is now the computer comes to work on this. It can't just grab byte, grab byte, grab byte, and go. It has to read what you have, adjust, do some operation, and then work on the data. So even though this is how people understand data, it slows down the operation of data by making it non-time. It doesn't follow a set amount of timing when it's operating. It can go in and the timing of operation varies every time you use it because there's a different amount of files stored. There's a different amount of components. There's a different size of them. So as it's running, now the computer, instead of operating quickly and always grabbing the same size and doing operations on them, it has to find out what size it is, then do operation. Find out what size it is, do operation. Find out what kind of content, what size, operation. What type and how many. So humans function this way. Humans understand stuff this way. Your filing system, you have an index, and then the contents. This is how we're now relating from what a computer does to how people understand it. And any type of data can be put into these variable lengths. So how people understand data. Characters and symbols in hexadecimal. We talked about that, hexadecimal, but now let's convert it back to how people understand. ASCII, let's see if I can open up a web browser here. You probably all have this in on your screen. Yeah. So on page 16 and 17, you'll see two tables I have from the internet. So I don't have to figure this out real quick. And this is a conversion from those hexadecimal characters to something that humans know. And you'll see each one on the ASCII table. There's hexadecimal values, and then the letter, what it means in English language. This is now converting what the computer does back to how people understand it. Any questions on that? And there's also Unicode, which is on the top of the next page. And what that does is ASCII has 2 characters, so 256 combinations. Originally, when computing started, it was mostly in the United States, and so that ASCII was developed, and it represents the English language and all the English characters. And then they figured out, hey, we need the rest of the world to be involved in computing, so they added another 2 characters, and with 2 characters, you get 256 combinations. What do you get with 4 characters of hexadecimal? Any guesses? 65,000 combinations. So now you can include every language of the world with just 4 characters. Very powerful. So commands, now instructions for computers. This is, anybody can try this on your computer. When you get this black screen, type in traceroute.google.com. That is a command, a string of these ASCII characters that is recognized now by the computer to tell it how to do something. So now we went from how computers are arranged, how bits are combined to bytes, how bytes make data, how data makes characters, and now we're back to how characters make commands to tell the computer to do something. This is the human-computer interface. But what this command does, it goes out, and if you want to play with it, I did it from my Tampa location, and it checks every machine that your computer goes across to get to Google from wherever you're at, because Google is a site, and tells you exactly how many machines it went across to get there. I like this one because people see that, hey, when I'm going across the internet, every time I do anything, I go across 10 plus machines. So that Google server somewhere else in the world is linked by all these routers, and you're not just going to Google, you're going to wherever is available to get a path to Google. So file storage, now we see that we can make commands, we can make files, we have software, and you all know how to store files. Anybody questions there? No? But you have memory, media, cloud storage. Doesn't really matter to you as long as you can get your data back, right? We'll talk about it a little bit later with the security involved with different ones of those. But for the most part, those files are the same no matter where they're stored, as long as you can get them back and prove that they're the same. Human content files also have headers and footers. This is a big thing with, if you ever look at if you open Adobe Acrobat in your computer and you search your file system, it'll show you all the PDFs, all the compatible files. So how does it know those files are compatible? Yeah, there's an extension on them, but anybody could change that extension if they wanted to play with it. There's a header at the beginning of each file that says, I'm an Adobe Acrobat file, I'm at this version, whatever, and then some information about the contents between. Security uses this a little bit where the header and the footer will have security information about how it's handled, who made it, what needs to be done with it, what protections on it. So for now, we'll just kind of talk about it as files are stored, files have headers, but there is some uses down the road we'll get to.